John Kennedy and Nancy Pelosi locked eyes in a Senate hearing that shifted the ground under both of them in real time, and the Louisiana senator turned one sharp insult into a long, careful examination that left the chamber quiet and the country watching. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I have spent years in the political arena and more years still speaking with you on nights like this, and I want to walk you through a hearing that has stayed with me. It was not loud from the first minute. It became something else because one experienced figure underestimated the other. Nancy Pelosi had just dismissed Senator John Kennedy as the kind of politician who treated a congressional hearing like a Louisiana crawfish boil. She delivered the line before millions of viewers with the steady confidence of someone who had spent nearly 4 decades making powerful men look smaller than they were. She expected the room to follow her lead because rooms had followed her lead for 39 years and because Washington had trained itself to laugh whenever Nancy Pelosi decided that someone else was beneath the occasion. What she did not account for was that John Kennedy was not offended, not rattled, and not even remotely surprised. He had spent his entire career waiting for opponents to confuse his accent with ignorance and his manners with weakness. The man she reduced to a provincial joke was a Vanderbilt graduate, a magna cum laude scholar, a Virginia-trained lawyer, an Oxford-educated legal mind, and a former Louisiana state treasurer who understood numbers far better than most people who claim to regulate them. Kennedy laughed. He removed his oversized glasses, cleaned them with a folded handkerchief, and prepared to turn Pelosi's crawfish boil into a setting where she would discover that she was no longer directing the hearing. The hearing had been underway for 11 minutes. Until that moment, Pelosi had controlled every inch of it with the practiced authority of a woman who had mastered the machinery of Congress long before many of the people in the room had won their first election. She had managed Democratic caucuses, forced legislation through hostile vote counts, survived presidents from both parties, ripped a State of the Union address on live television, and converted political theater into lasting influence before the paper had finished falling. Nancy Pelosi did not simply enter political spaces because entering implied that the space existed independently of her. She behaved as though every committee room, press conference, and legislative fight became her property the second she appeared. Her 6-minute opening statement had been pure Pelosi, polished enough to sound responsible, firm enough to sound sincere, and carefully constructed to suggest that questioning her record was not oversight but disrespect. She supported congressional trading reform. She claimed the Stock Act existed because of her leadership. She endorsed legislation carrying her name without accepting responsibility for why her name had become politically inseparable from congressional stock trading. And she insisted there was nothing to hide. Kennedy sat 4 chairs away behind a Louisiana nameplate, wearing a loose tie and glasses that made him look less like a prosecutor than a man who had wandered indoors after checking a fence line. That appearance was not an accident in any meaningful political sense, because Kennedy understood that obvious power makes opponents cautious, while concealed power makes them careless. Pelosi knew the accent was a tool. She knew the confused squint was often theater. She knew the harmless country lawyer routine usually ended with a witness trapped inside a question that sounded simple only until the numbers arrived. But recognizing a tactic is not the same as respecting the person using it. And Pelosi had never respected politicians who chose to hide their intelligence instead of displaying it like a congressional title. When the chairman turned toward Kennedy, Pelosi leaned near her microphone and said she hoped the senator from Louisiana had a question that did not sound like it came from a county fair. This was the United States Senate, she said, not a crawfish boil. The laughter that followed was not warm, generous, or accidental. It was the laughter of a room watching an established political figure publicly reduce a colleague and assume there would be no cost. Kennedy responded with the slow smile of a man who had just received permission to stop being polite. Then he removed his glasses and cleaned them. While the room waited for him to decide how expensive Pelosi's remark would become, he acknowledged the county fair. He mentioned funnel cake, ring toss, and the game where people guess the weight of a pig. He allowed Pelosi's supporters a final moment to believe he was accepting the role she had assigned him. Then he shifted the comparison toward money. He said that at a county fair, someone might enter with $100 and leave holding a teddy bear, confused about where the cash had gone. In Pelosi's case, he said the process appeared to operate in reverse because her family had entered public life with approximately $610,000 and somehow emerged with an estimated fortune of $649 million. The gallery erupted because Kennedy had not merely returned Pelosi's insult. He had attached the arithmetic to it and delivered the bill in front of the same audience she had tried to entertain. Before the laughter could fully settle, he opened the worn manila folder he carried into hearings, a battered paper file that looked ordinary enough to contain grocery receipts but rarely contained anything harmless. Kennedy did not rely on a glowing laptop, an oversized display, or a staff-produced presentation designed to make preparation visible. His paper pages, handwritten notes, and carefully placed tabs communicated something colder. A laptop announced that a senator had prepared for the hearing. Kennedy's folder suggested that he had been reading the records for years and had merely chosen this afternoon to discuss them publicly. He called himself an unsophisticated country lawyer. He contrasted his habits with Paul Pelosi's options trading. He made clear that his questions would focus not on whether trades occurred, but on when the legally required disclosures were filed. The Stock Act required covered transactions to be disclosed within 45 days, a deadline simple enough to understand without an accountant, a securities attorney, or a carefully worded statement from a congressional communications office. Kennedy read the dates one by one, beginning with a Visa transaction executed on July 1st, 2024, but disclosed 67 days later, placing it 22 days beyond the statutory requirement. He moved to Nvidia options executed in November 2023 and disclosed 52 days later. Then to Tempest AI options executed in January 2025 and disclosed 89 days later, 44 days beyond the legal deadline. The pattern mattered because Pelosi's defense depended on technical compliance. Yet the calendar did not bend simply because the transactions belonged to the husband of one of the most powerful political figures in modern American history. 45 days was the requirement. 67 was not 45. 52 was not 45, and 89 was not a rounding error that could be erased through prestige, procedure, or indignation. Kennedy then introduced Earl Thibodeau, a 63-year-old Baton Rouge plumber who had spent most of his adult life repairing pipes and had accumulated roughly $180,000 in retirement savings through ordinary work, modeste contribution, and the kind of patience Washington politicians praise but rarely practice. Earl held blue-chip stocks, including Visa, because his financial advisor told him the company was stable, which is how retirement planning works for people who do not receive confidential briefings, influence legislative calendars, or share dinner with congressional leadership. Earl once filed his taxes 3 days late and received a $340 penalty from the Internal Revenue Service, a punishment he paid because ordinary citizens cannot hold a press conference declaring that deadlines are complicated. Paul Pelosi's disclosures, by contrast, arrived weeks late on transactions involving far more money. Yet there had been no equivalent penalty, no public warning, and no visible urgency from the institutions supposedly responsible for enforcing the rules. Kennedy asked the question Pelosi's polished opening statement had carefully avoided. Was the Stock Act written for Earl Thibodeau, or was it written for politically connected families who could ignore deadlines until the paperwork became convenient? Pelosi reached for the microphone with the quick procedural instinct of someone who had spent decades stopping difficult questions before they could become difficult answers. She began explaining that Stock Act filing requirements were handled by her office in accordance with applicable procedures. But Kennedy cut through the institutional language with the one thing institutional language cannot defeat: basic subtraction. He stated that 67 days was not 45 and pointed to Section 105, under which a willful violation could carry a fine of up to $50,000 and as much as 1 year in prison for each violation. 3 late disclosures could therefore represent as much as $150,000 in potential fines and 3 years of potential exposure, while Earl's 3-day delay had already cost him $340 without a committee hearing, legal team, or sympathetic press statement. Kennedy removed his glasses again, cleaned the lenses with the same deliberate handkerchief, and allowed the room to understand that every time those glasses came off, another layer of the carefully maintained defense was about to come off with them. The shift in Kennedy's voice was almost imperceptible, but it changed the entire hearing. The country draw remained while the softness behind it disappeared. What emerged was the disciplined cadence of a lawyer who understood that a serious question does not need to be shouted when the record can carry the weight. Kennedy quoted the standard response Pelosi's office had repeated so often that it had become less a defense than a reflex. Speaker Pelosi does not own any stocks and has no prior knowledge or subsequent involvement in any transactions. He acknowledged that the wording was technically accurate because the stocks were held by Paul Pelosi through Financial Leasing Services Incorporated under his account and under his name. Then Kennedy removed his glasses, unfolded the handkerchief, and asked the question that reduced decades of legal insulation to one plain sentence. Do you need to own the cow to drink the milk? The room erupted again, but this time the reaction carried something more pointed than amusement, because everyone understood that the comparison was not merely rural color. The cow was Paul Pelosi's portfolio. The milk was the wealth that supported the Pelosi household. And the issue was whether a spouse could set aside responsibility for profits while living entirely inside the life those profits purchased. Kennedy had taken a carefully constructed legal distinction and made it sound as straightforward as it appeared when stripped of Washington vocabulary. Pelosi's jaw tightened for only a moment, but that moment revealed the problem she could not dismiss with procedure. Being offended by the comparison did not make the logic disappear. The question was not who physically clicked the button to purchase an option, but who benefited from the transaction and whether access to political information had value inside the marriage. Kennedy pressed the point by describing the $25 million home, the lifestyle financed by investment income, and a portfolio that had reportedly outperformed the broader market by a margin ordinary investors could not approach. Paul Pelosi's investments had produced returns that Kennedy described as approximately 180% during a period in which the S&P 500 had returned roughly 100 percentage points less. The issue was not that profitable investing was automatically improper, because that would have been easy to dismiss, but that consistent market-beating performance becomes difficult to separate from questions of access when one spouse controls legislative timing. Pelosi could claim that she did not own the shares, but she could not seriously claim that she did not live inside the wealth those shares created. Kennedy stated the matter plainly. She did not own the stocks, but she owned the life the stocks had built. That distinction mattered because almost every other area of enforcement recognizes that the actor and the beneficiary do not become strangers simply because assets are held in one spouse's name. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not stop asking questions merely because the person receiving the benefit did not personally execute the trade. Serious inquiries examine sources, relationships, shared financial interests, communication patterns, and the movement of information before a transaction occurs. Congress, however, had protected itself with language that allowed powerful officials to point toward a spouse and act as though the marriage ended at the brokerage account. Kennedy was not inventing a new standard. He was showing how congressional families had asked for a special standard that would sound unusual if applied anywhere outside Capitol Hill. He turned toward the back of the folder where a single red tab stood apart from the yellow markers that had guided the earlier questions. The next section focused on timing because the defense always emphasized that every trade was publicly disclosed while avoiding the more important question of what happened before the public disclosure. Kennedy said Paul Pelosi's portfolio appeared to possess an extraordinary ability to move before the market, before federal enforcement announcements, and before ordinary investors understood what was about to happen. He compared that talent to a Louisiana chicken that seemed to know rain was coming before the Weather Channel announced it. He explained that he would not assume the chicken had become a meteorologist. He would assume someone had told the chicken. The laughter arrived, but it ended faster than before because the audience had learned that Kennedy's comparisons were not conclusions. They were doors leading into pages of dates and dollar amounts. On July 1st, 2024, Paul Pelosi sold 2,000 shares of Visa valued between $500,000 and $1 million. 85 days later, the Department of Justice sued Visa over alleged antitrust violations, sending the stock lower. In December 2022, Paul Pelosi sold 30,000 shares of Google, and 1 month later, the Department of Justice filed an antitrust action against Google. In January 2025, he purchased Tempest AI options, and within roughly 30 days, the stock moved from approximately $35 to $89, representing a gain of around 154% in a single month. Any one trade could be called coincidence, but a pattern of conveniently timed moves demanded more than the familiar statement that Nancy Pelosi did not personally own stocks. Kennedy returned to Earl Thibito because numbers become easier for Washington to ignore when they remain abstract and much harder when attached to a person who has to postpone repairing his roof. Earl still owned Visa in his retirement account when the Justice Department announced its action, and the decline cost him about $2,800. That money represented Christmas gifts, household repairs, and years of careful saving. Paul Pelosi had exited the position 85 days earlier while Earl remained exposed because Earl did not share a home with a former Speaker of the House or move inside circles where enforcement priorities were discussed before they reached the public. Kennedy cited a study attributed to the National Bureau of Economic Research indicating that congressional leaders had outperformed their peers by as much as 47%. That kind of advantage was difficult to explain as instinct, discipline, or luck when the people achieving it also controlled hearings, schedules, legislation, and access to material information. Then Kennedy asked the 5 words that would define the hearing. "Who told the chicken, ma'am?" The line sounded like a remark from a Louisiana feed store, but underneath the accent was the exact question asked in every serious inquiry into the movement of information. Who provided the material non-public details? The strength of the question was not its humor, but its refusal to accept the preferred distraction. Whether Nancy Pelosi clicked the trade was secondary if information moved through the household before the market received it. The chicken was not the issue. The chicken was the recipient. And the only question that mattered was where the warning came from. Pelosi could mock the accent, the comparisons, and the folder, but she could not make the sequence of trades and federal actions disappear. Pelosi reached for the protection of procedure and raised a point of order, arguing that Kennedy's line of questioning rested on speculation rather than evidence. Kennedy refused the escape and answered that he had asked a question, not issued a verdict, and that a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars justified asking who had supplied the advantage. He repeated that somebody should ask, because Congress had spent years treating obvious conflicts as impolite subjects rather than matters requiring examination. The very institution that demanded transparency from banks, executives, and private citizens had somehow decided that questions about its own members were improper unless prosecutors had already completed the work Congress refused to begin. Kennedy then turned to the final tab, making clear that the stock portfolio was only one part of a broader argument about whether the Pelosi family operated under the same rules as Earl Thibito's family. He read the record of Paul Pelosi's 2022 DUI case in Napa County, including the blood alcohol level above the legal limit, the collision that injured another driver, the misdemeanor plea, the 5-day sentence served through community service, and the 3 years of probation. Kennedy then referenced the alleged July 3rd, 2026 hit-and-run incident, carefully noting that the investigation remained ongoing and that no final conclusion had been reached. He did not introduce the incidents merely to embarrass Pelosi's husband, because embarrassment was politically survivable, and Nancy Pelosi had survived far worse. He introduced them to show a recurring separation between the rules publicly celebrated by the political class and the consequences privately experienced by connected families. The glasses came off for the third time. The handkerchief moved across the lenses, and the room understood that Kennedy was preparing to connect the family record to the institution Pelosi now wanted to build in her own name. Kennedy turned from Paul Pelosi's legal troubles to the $50 million Nancy Pelosi Institute for Representative Democracy being developed at UC Berkeley, an institution designed to teach Congress ethics and democratic governance under the name of a woman whose family finances had just faced a series of questions no ordinary family could avoid. He noted that Pelosi would help lead instruction on the legislative process and public ethics, which would have sounded merely self-congratulatory under normal circumstances, but now sounded almost aggressively detached from the record sitting inside his folder. The Institute was not simply another post-congressional project, because it was an attempt to preserve a curated version of Pelosi's legacy before the uncurated version could harden in the public mind. Kennedy stated that he did not know how to describe the distance with the politeness Pelosi expected from what she had mocked as a crawfish boil, so he chose plain language instead. A family surrounded by late disclosures, extraordinary investment performance, a DUI conviction, an ongoing hit-and-run investigation, and unanswered questions about information flow was now raising $50 million to teach the country how ethical government was supposed to work. Kennedy did not claim that the Institute itself was improper, because that was not required to show the distance on this scale. He argued that the problem was the gap between the legacy Pelosi wanted engraved on a building and the financial record she declined to explain under direct questioning. Washington called that distance legacy building. But in Louisiana, Kennedy said people would call it brass, the kind of nerve required to turn unresolved questions into a curriculum and unanswered matters into a naming opportunity. The Institute and the record were not the same structure, no matter how much money donors poured into the foundation or how many carefully worded course descriptions celebrated democratic responsibility. Someday, Kennedy warned, a student could walk into that institute, open a Stock Act filing, compare the dates, examine the trades, and ask the question Pelosi's own institution would never be able to teach away. Who told the chicken? Pelosi responded because silence had never been her preferred approach, and because she had not survived nearly 4 decades in Washington by allowing a senator in a loose tie to define her record without resistance. She described Kennedy's presentation as entertainment rather than evidence, and dismissed the cows, chickens, county fairs, and Louisiana comparisons as performance designed for cameras instead of serious oversight. She insisted that her family's finances were fully disclosed, fully compliant, and fully transparent, emphasizing that every trade and every filing was publicly available. Then she challenged Kennedy to refer any actual evidence of wrongdoing to the proper authorities rather than continuing with suggestion and comparison. With the authority of someone accustomed to closing debates by declaring them closed, she announced that she considered the line of questioning finished. The answer was effective, in the narrow way. Pelosi answers had always been effective, because it sounded controlled, official, and final, without resolving a single number Kennedy had placed into the record. Her supporters exhaled. Her staff began mentally cutting the clip into a favorable response, and the familiar Washington machinery prepared to convert refusal into strength. Kennedy nodded slowly, because he had expected precisely that defense, particularly the phrase fully transparent, which gave him the cleanest possible opening for the final question. He did not argue with her tone, dispute her title, or compete with her command of congressional procedure. He simply said he wanted to test the transparency she had just claimed using one number and one direct answer. Kennedy returned to the first financial disclosure from 1987, when the Pelosi family entered Congress with reported stock holdings valued between approximately $610,000 and $785,000. He compared that starting point with an estimated present net worth of $649 million, a figure so large that no amount of procedural language could make the arithmetic look ordinary. He then calculated Pelosi's congressional salary across 39 years at roughly $8.7 million, using a generous estimate that already favored her side of the equation. Subtracting $8.7 million from $649 million left approximately $640.3 million that did not come from the salary attached to her public office. Kennedy looked directly at Pelosi and asked where the remaining $640 million came from. He did not deliver the question with theatrical outrage, because outrage would have given Pelosi something to attack, while arithmetic gave her nothing but the result. The sentence came quietly with the patience of a lawyer questioning a witness after every exhibit had already been entered into the record. Pelosi had declared the finances fully transparent, so Kennedy made the missing $640 million the transparency test and invited her to pass it in front of the country. A clear explanation would have ended the argument, exposed Kennedy's presentation as empty theater, and restored the control she had claimed at the beginning of the hearing. An inability to explain it would reveal that transparency was not a description of the family's finances, but a phrase used whenever the details became too politically expensive to discuss. Kennedy did not complete the next sentence because completion was unnecessary and the unfinished thought became more pointed than another statement could have been. If Pelosi explained that the fortune came from Paul Pelosi's trades, then the claim that those trades were separate from her public position collapsed back into the cow and milk problem she had already declined to confront. If she said she did not know, then one of the most powerful political figures in American history was acknowledging that she could not explain the origin of hundreds of millions of dollars shared by her household. If she claimed the investments were simply brilliant, she would still have to address the timing, the late filings, the extraordinary market performance, and the repeated proximity between major trades and government action. Every possible answer opened another door, while silence left all of them standing open at once. For the first time in the hearing, Pelosi did not reach for the microphone, invoke procedure, accuse Kennedy of speculation, or remind the room of her record. The silence was not the calculated pause of a veteran politician arranging the perfect sentence, because the perfect sentence did not exist. Any answer broad enough to sound safe would fail the arithmetic, while any answer specific enough to satisfy the arithmetic could expose the very relationship between power, access, and profit that her defense was designed to set aside. The woman who had spent decades controlling the order in which questions could be asked now faced a question that controlled every possible answer. Kennedy had reduced 39 years of authority, hundreds of millions of dollars, and pages of legal distinctions to a subtraction problem simple enough for Earl Thibito to understand at his kitchen table. Kennedy closed the manila folder, placed the handkerchief back in his pocket, and straightened the loose tie. Pelosi had mistaken for evidence that he did not belong in the room. He thanked her, yielded his time, and apologized for turning the hearing into a crawfish boil, adding that at a crawfish boil, people at least knew what they were paying for. The line landed because Pelosi's insult had now become the frame through which the entire exchange would be remembered. Only the frame no longer diminished Kennedy. It diminished the system he had just described, a system in which ordinary citizens paid immediate penalties while politically connected families filed late, moved early, and called the resulting opacity transparency. Kennedy had finished speaking, but the question he left behind had only begun moving. Within hours, 3 separate clips escaped the hearing room and reached 3 different audiences, each carrying weight for a different reason. The first was the cow question. Do you need to own the cow to drink the milk? It spread because it was memorable enough for casual viewers and precise enough for those who follow disclosure rules. The second was, who told the chicken, ma'am? A phrase that converted questions about congressional trading into a 4-word public inquiry anyone could repeat. The third was the arithmetic. $649 million minus $8.7 million, leaving roughly $640 million that Pelosi had been invited to explain and had not explained. Together, the 3 clips stripped away prestige, procedure, and decades of political branding until the hearing was no longer remembered as Pelosi dismissing Kennedy, but as Kennedy inviting Pelosi to sit with the fortune she had called fully transparent. The cow clip moved first because it operated on two levels at once, reaching viewers who enjoyed the exchange and those who understood that the point rested on a legitimate question about benefits. Do you need to own the cow to drink the milk? Accumulated approximately 23 million views because Kennedy had compressed the entire spousal benefit issue into language no communications director could bury under technical jargon. People shared it because it was clear, but those familiar with enforcement shared it because the beneficiary of a transaction does not become irrelevant merely because someone else signed the trade. Kennedy had taken the question that regulators ask in serious cases and delivered it in a form that farmers, retirees, attorneys, and congressional staffers could understand immediately. Pelosi's team could dismiss the line as folksy theater, but every attempt to mock the comparison only repeated the comparison and pushed the issue in front of another audience. The chicken clip followed with roughly 19 million views and became even more difficult to contain because who told the chicken worked beyond the Pelosi hearing. Within hours, the phrase had become a public shorthand for every conveniently timed congressional purchase, sale, option, and disclosure that appeared to anticipate information unavailable to ordinary investors. Memes spread, merchandise appeared, and an account devoted to congressional trading filings reportedly attracted millions of followers by attaching a chicken symbol to each questionable transaction. The phrase survived because it asked what official Washington had trained itself not to ask, which was not whether the paperwork eventually became public, but whether someone received useful information before everyone else. Pelosi had demanded evidence rather than animals and county fairs. Yet the chicken remained because the dates Kennedy read were harder to dismiss than his accent. The third clip required no rural comparison, no punchline, and no understanding of securities law because it relied entirely on subtraction. An estimated $649 million fortune minus approximately $8.7 million in congressional salary left about $640 million that Pelosi had been given an opportunity to explain. That clip reached approximately 14 million viewers and moved through financial media, retirement forums, investment communities, and the private conversations of Americans who knew how difficult it was to grow a modest portfolio without extraordinary access or extraordinary luck. Viewers did not need to prove anything specific to recognize that the gap invited an answer, especially after Pelosi had personally described the family finances as fully transparent. Arithmetic did what political rhetoric could not, because once the numbers were placed beside each other on live television, no statement from a press office could make them separate again. During the first week, Pelosi's office released an unusually short statement calling Kennedy's questions folksy theater and insisting that the family's disclosures complied with applicable law. The statement did not explain why multiple filings appeared beyond the 45-day deadline, did not address whether Pelosi benefited from her husband's transactions, and did not identify the source of approximately $640 million in accumulated wealth. It did not answer the Visa timing, the Google timing, the Tempest AI timing, Earl Thibaude's penalty, or the difference between 3 late tax days for a plumber and dozens of late disclosure days for a politically connected investor. The statement addressed the presentation because addressing the calendar would have required changing the calendar, and addressing the arithmetic would have required producing different numbers. In Washington, calling documented questions theater is often what remains when the documents themselves decline to cooperate. A formal review of Paul Pelosi's Stock Act filing dates followed, focused specifically on the disclosures Kennedy had read into the record. The review centered on whether the filings were late and whether any delay could be considered willful under Section 105, which carried the potential penalties Kennedy had already described. It was not yet the full examination Pelosi's critics demanded, but it represented the first institutional acknowledgement that the dates could not simply be erased through a general declaration of compliance. Senator Rick Scott used the hearing to renew pressure for a broader examination of the trading history and requested a Government Accountability Office review of congressional trading patterns. The GAO accepted an audit in which the filings would serve as a central case study, meaning the manila folder had moved from a hearing room prop into the machinery of government oversight. During the second week, the SEC issued guidance addressing the spousal issue more generally and clarified that disclosure obligations included the financial interests of a filer's spouse. The memo further indicated that whether an official benefited from a spouse's trading activity could become relevant to enforcement, which was the formal language version of Kennedy's cow question. Pelosi's name did not need to appear in the document because the entire financial press understood why the clarification had arrived when it did and which controversy had made the issue difficult to avoid. The answer was straightforward. Direct ownership was not the only factor, and a person did not need to hold the account personally to benefit from the wealth it produced. Kennedy's dairy comparison had survived contact with federal guidance because beneath the language was a principle Washington had spent years treating as too complicated to state plainly. Paul Pelosi's legal team then filed an amended disclosure covering transactions from 2023 through 2026, correcting dates and adding more detail to descriptions that had previously been defended as fully compliant. The filing was described as voluntary, but voluntary actions become less impressive when they occur only after millions of viewers watch a senator read the defects aloud. Correcting records after declaring them complete did not establish any particular intent, but it undercut the confidence with which Pelosi had insisted that there was nothing meaningful to correct. The amendment became its own form of testimony, not because it admitted the most serious questions, but because it acknowledged that the original paperwork had not been as flawless as the public statement claimed. Kennedy had not forced an answer from Pelosi during the hearing, yet the pressure from his questions forced the documents to begin answering for her. By the third week, fundraising for the Nancy Pelosi Institute had not collapsed, but it had stalled, which was quieter than open controversy and often more consequential to institutions built on reputation. 3 donors connected to approximately $4.2 million in pledges reportedly requested pauses while questions surrounding the family's financial disclosures remained unresolved. They did not need to accuse anyone of anything because major donors rarely speak in accusations when 2 words, such as reputational concerns, can freeze millions of dollars without creating unnecessary liability. Similar language appeared in financial circles evaluating products connected to congressional trading, showing that the problem was no longer confined to partisan commentary or viral clips. When donors and investment professionals begin using the same cautious phrase, the phrase is no longer merely public relations language. It is the financial system pricing uncertainty into a political legacy. The separate investigation involving the alleged July 3, 2026 hit and run remained preliminary. Paul Pelosi had not been charged, and the facts had not reached a final legal conclusion, yet the existence of that investigation placed beside the DUI conviction, the late disclosures, the remarkable trades, the spousal benefit defense, and the unanswered $640 million question created a pattern too visible for a $50 million institute to set aside. The pattern did not require every allegation to become a conviction because its central message concerned privilege, consequence, and the radically different versions of accountability experienced by powerful families and ordinary citizens. Earl Thabito paid $340 for filing taxes 3 days late, while disclosures involving millions arrived weeks late and required a nationally televised confrontation before institutions showed interest. The contradiction was not hidden inside legal theory. It was sitting in plain view, dividing the country into people who absorbed penalties immediately and people who debated whether rules applied after the deadline had already passed. Earl never became a cable news celebrity, never launched a political organization, and never stood beside Kennedy while the viral clips played, because he remained what Washington so often forgets: an ordinary citizen living with the consequences of decisions made elsewhere. He had lost roughly $2,800 in retirement value after the visa action, postponed expenses his family understood personally, and watched a politically connected investor leave the position 85 days earlier. His question was simpler than Kennedy's comparisons and more pointed than Pelosi's prepared statement. Why do ordinary people face immediate consequences while powerful people receive explanations, amendments, and additional time? Kennedy returned to Louisiana without a victory tour, fed his actual chickens, and waited for the next set of filings to arrive, because people surrounded by extraordinary wealth and protected by technical language rarely stop producing records. The manila folder would fill again. The glasses would come off again. And somewhere between a late disclosure and another carefully timed trade, someone would eventually have to answer, who told the chicken?